Welcome back. In this section, we're going to be learning the names of structures of the ovary. So the first thing is, this is where the female gametes kind of hang out until they decide to develop or are called to duty. And so a certain amount will do that every month. So the rest are just kind of hanging out in suspended animation, not doing anything, not developing, and essentially looking like not much of anything. And so the follicles that are hanging out doing nothing, they are going to be the smallest, and they are known as primordial follicles. So on the models and in pictures of the ovary, you're looking for your smallest primordial follicles. Then every month, somewhere between a half a dozen and a dozen start the pathway. Now they don't get through the pathway in that cycle, so they will continue on, and this is why we have follicles in all stages of development at all time, because sometimes it'll take them 2 months and sometimes take them 3 months, and realize usually every month only one completes the cycle and the others just kind of like die out partway through. So after the primordial follicle, which is where we have a female gamete in the middle known as a primary oocyte surrounded by a thin layer of epithelial tissue which looks very flat and squamous on a single layer. A primordial follicle will then develop into a primary follicle. And if we look at this ovary on the left and up close, which is this bottom picture, you can see this circular structure on the bottom left, where we have one layer of what now looks like cuboidal epithelium surrounding this cell. And so once you have a single layer of cuboidal epithelium instead of the very fat, very flat, inactive epithelium, now we're going to call it a primary follicle. And the primary follicle is going to start secreting the hormones and tiny bits of fluid, and the hormones are going to stimulate it to develop even more. So once then we have 2 or more layers of cells surrounding the oocyte, we're going to call it a secondary follicle. And in the secondary follicle is when the fluid that each individual cell is starting to accumulate or starting to produce will start accumulating, and that's what this little black line here is representing, is that fluid is starting to collect, and this is what's going to be this blue substance in the middle of this cell. At just before the time of ovulation, you will see that there is one of these follicles which is actually bulging on the surface of the ovary, and this is going to be our tertiary follicle. And this is the one that's going to be ovulating. You can see on the model on the left, the little oocyte with its surrounding cells being ovulated. After ovulation, the cells that were left behind start producing massive amounts of hormone in anticipation of a pregnancy. And so because the female hormones are steroid-based, which is a lipid, these cells become a deep yellow in color. And this forms a structure known as the corpus luteum, or the corpus luteum, which is the remnant of what was the follicle. The model on the left, the far left arrow, shows that there is some hemorrhage. This is a recently ovulated follicle with blood inside it, because that is normal. I don't know if you realize, in order for ovulation to occur, it actually has to rip through some ovarian tissue to release its contents. And then on that same model, there is a second corpus luteum on the right, because there's often more than one. There's the current one, and then there's previous ones which are shrinking down in size. And eventually, every corpus luteum turns into a white scar. So you will have a microscopic white scar for every single time that ovary ovulated. And each of these is known as the white body or the corpus albicans. So that's kind of it as far as looking at the follicles as a whole, but let's look a little closer at some things that are going on. First off, the area where the fluid collects within the follicle. So this starts developing in the secondary follicle, and in the tertiary follicle, it is quite large. This is known as the antrim of the follicle. And what it's doing is actually separating the layers of the cell wall of the follicle, so that part of the cells will exit with the oocyte and part of them will stay behind to form the corpus luteum and produce those hormones. So at the time of ovulation, it is no longer a primary oocyte, it's a secondary oocyte, meaning it's still in meiosis 2. It has not completed meiosis 2 and will not complete meiosis 2 unless it gets fertilized. And so this is the oocyte, and the oocyte is like the largest cell that there is. It's so much larger than the sperm cell, and it's so much larger than the other ovarian cells. If you look at the histology pictures, the cells that we were forming from one layer to multiple layers, which would then be producing the fluid in the antrim, each of these cells is known as a granulosa cell. So you can see the size of all these nuclei for the granulosa cell and compare it to the size outlined here in blue or outlined here in this pale pink. That's the size of the oocyte. So the oocyte is huge by comparison. And surrounding the oocyte at the time of ovulation are going to be some of those granulosa cells. So if you notice on this picture, the antrim kind of separates the granulosa cells. So we have some that are going to stay behind at the time of ovulation, and then this is going to kind of detach itself, and this is the part that's going to be ovulated. So at ovulation, you're going to have this layer of granulosa cells, which are on the external surface of the oocyte. And this layer of cells is known as the corona radiata, or the sun's rays. And basically, this is like the bubble wrap. So as it's tumbling around, no damage is happening to the oocyte. And if you're losing some of these cells, no big loss, because these cells are in the process of dying anyway. They are meant to be sacrificed. They aren't doing anything anymore except acting as protection for the oocyte. Now, between the corona radiata, those granulosa cells, and the oocyte, there is an acellular layer, which is what the corona radiata is kind of sticking to, and this is called the zona pellucida. And with that, we are done with ovarian structures, and I will see you in our last segment where we are going to look at structures of the breast. So thank you so much for your dedication. I'll see you shortly.